The man who cannot be controlled is not the loudest in the room. He's the quietest, the calmest, the most unpredictable. In a world obsessed with shaping behavior, with managing responses, with rewarding obedience and punishing deviation, the man who refuses to play along becomes dangerous, not because he threatens with violence, but because he cannot be tamed. You see, modern control is no longer enforced with chains or bars. It's done through emotion, through guilt, through praise, through fear of exclusion. Society doesn't need to imprison you to control you. It only needs to make you need its validation. But what happens when a man no longer needs it? When he doesn't chase approval, doesn't crave recognition, doesn't bend to the weight of expectation? That man becomes a problem, an anomaly, a crack in the system, because he does not respond to the usual tools of control. He cannot be manipulated with rewards or provoked by threats. He listens, but he's not swayed. He sees, but he's not stirred. He walks through the noise untouched, not because he's blind to it, but because he's chosen sovereignty over submission. Machiavelli understood this kind of power. He knew that the greatest threat to a system built on influence is a man who cannot be influenced. A man who sets his own terms, holds his own line, and keeps his own counsel. Not to rebel, but simply because he sees no need to conform. This is why the world fears independence. Not the independence of speech, but the independence of mind. The ability to walk away without explanation, to say no without anger, to exist without seeking to be seen. That kind of presence shakes people, because most people are easy to read, easy to trigger, easy to move. But not him. He doesn't flinch. He doesn't overreact. He doesn't fall into the trap of urgency, and that makes him unreadable, unpredictable, unstoppable. He is not at war with the world. He simply isn't owned by it. And that alone makes him feared. Because in a time when everyone is trained to be agreeable, to be digestible, to fit in perfectly without friction, the man who doesn't care if you understand him becomes a silent rebellion. His very stillness feels offensive. His calm makes others nervous. His lack of need exposes their desperation. And while they scramble to control perception, to manage optics, to adjust their personality for every room they enter, he remains the same. Grounded, quiet, unbothered. He is the ghost they can't predict, the storm they can't prepare for, the piece of the system that doesn't follow the script. And that, more than rage, more than volume, more than threat, is what terrifies them. The man who can't be controlled doesn't need to dominate. He only needs to refuse to be moved. That refusal, calm, clear, and deliberate, is the most feared trait of all. What gives a man the power to resist, to stand still while the world pushes and pulls, is not stubbornness. It's not pride. It's self-determination. The ability to decide for yourself what matters and what doesn't. This is where true power begins. Because once a man no longer needs to ask for permission, once he no longer needs applause to feel right, he becomes untouchable. He becomes the architect of his own world, while everyone else is still renting space in someone else's. Machiavelli understood this intimately. He wrote not just for rulers, but for those who wanted to rule. First over others, yes, but more importantly, over themselves. He warned that a man swayed by emotion, by public opinion, or by the desire to be loved was a man easily undone. A prince must be prepared to act against mercy, against faith, even against humanity, if necessary, not because he is cruel, but because he must decide rather than be decided for. The man who can't be controlled doesn't wait for consensus. He doesn't need the crowd to clap before he moves. He sets his own tempo, his own rules, and if others don't understand, he's fine with that. His compass is internal, not external. His values are not up for negotiation, and because of this, he becomes dangerous, not by force, but by autonomy. Because when you can't be tempted with the usual offers, status, attention, comfort, You leave those in power with nothing to bargain with, and that, to them, is intolerable, because control relies on leverage. If they can't find your weakness, your need, your fear, your longing, they can't pull your strings. So they call you arrogant, cold, detached, but what you really are is free. He does not react to pressure, he studies it. He does not avoid discomfort, he absorbs it and uses it. He's not in a hurry to win anyone over because he's not competing for validation. That's why he moves different. He negotiates from strength because he's willing to walk away. He doesn't bluff because he doesn't need to. He's not playing for short-term rewards because he's built his patience like a weapon. You can't seduce him with promises or threaten him with loss because he's already made peace with what he can't control. People call that dangerous, and it is. Not to the innocent, but to the manipulators, to those who rely on keeping others emotionally unstable, to those who build systems based on need, on insecurity, on addiction to attention. The man who is self-determined is the crack in their foundation, because he doesn't just say no, he means it. And he doesn't just resist influence, he operates outside of it. That's why he's feared, because he lives by his own code. And when a man no longer flinches, no longer begs, no longer bites at every bait, they realize he can't be moved. And what can't be moved can't be controlled. When you don't need anything from anyone, you become impossible to dominate. That's not a quote, it's a reality. One that most people never get to experience because most people are addicted to approval, addicted to being liked, addicted to being seen in the right light. But the man who is truly independent, the one who does not need to be accepted, validated, forgiven, or understood, is the most feared man in the room, because he is immune to the weapons that control most of society. Guilt won't move him, shame won't soften him, praise won't sway him. He has detached his identity from the opinions of others, and that makes him unbreakable. This is the man who is no longer emotionally leveraged. He can care deeply without becoming dependent. He can walk away from love, from friendship, even from admiration, if it means protecting his center. And that unsettles people, because most power structures, whether personal, professional, or political, rely on your need to belong, your fear of disapproval, your craving for emotional connection. But he's already faced that hunger. He's already burned through that weakness in private. So now in public, he walks like he owes no one anything, not because he's heartless, but because he's free. When you try to manipulate this man, you'll find nothing to grip. Try to guilt him, he won't flinch. Try to flatter him, he won't lean in. Try to threaten him, he'll nod and still do what he planned. This is the terrifying stillness of someone who has mastered detachment, not out of coldness but out of clarity. And clarity is a threat to every system built on confusion and emotional fog. You can't play games with a man who doesn't need to win them. You can't bribe someone who's already content. And you can't guilt someone who refuses to carry what isn't his. Machiavelli understood that dependency was a silent leash. The more you need, the easier you are to move. And the more you signal those needs, through desperation, over-explaining, apologizing for your truth, the more predictable you become. But when a man stands with no emotional debt to collect, no validation to beg for, no approval to chase, he becomes unclassifiable. They don't know how to label him, how to shame him, how to reward or punish him, because he doesn't react the way they expect. This is why independence terrifies. Not because it's loud, but because it's self-contained. Because the truly independent man doesn't ask for power, he is power. And that kind of presence can't be controlled, only respected or feared. Because in a world built to shape you, the man who shapes himself becomes the anomaly. And the anomaly always threatens the system. Not through rebellion, not through noise, but simply by needing nothing and moving as if that truth is final. The most dangerous man in any room isn't the one who shouts, who swings, who postures. It's the one you can't predict. the one who doesn't respond the way you expect, the one who listens more than he speaks, watches more than he moves. In the psychology of manipulation, everything depends on patterns, predictable emotional responses that can be triggered, used, and steered. But when you remove that pattern, when you don't flinch on cue, when you don't react to praise or pressure, the entire system breaks down. Because now they don't know what to do, and you have all the control. This is why unpredictability is power, not chaos, not instability, but deliberate, controlled stillness in the face of provocation. When they expect anger, you give silence. When they expect begging, you give distance. When they expect weakness, you give nothing at all. And that nothing becomes everything. It becomes the void they can't understand, the blank space they rush to fill, the silence they mistake for strategy because it is. When a man refuses to play the emotional game, he becomes unreadable, and what cannot be read cannot be manipulated. Machiavelli wrote that it's not enough to have power, one must also control perception. And what's more confusing, more destabilizing, more intimidating than a man who keeps his intent hidden, who moves like a shadow, never reacting on time, never chasing what everyone else chases, never speaking just to be heard. He doesn't tip his hand, he doesn't explain his thoughts. And that restraint drives people crazy because they want to solve him, decode him, categorize him, but they can't. He's not an equation. They can't solve for X because X keeps changing. That's when you realize the strongest move is sometimes no move at all. Because the more you withhold, the more others reveal. They start projecting, over-talking, overreaching, trying to force a response that never comes. And in doing so, they expose themselves, their strategy, their weakness, their hunger. Meanwhile, you're calm, you're centered. You're watching it all unfold, quietly gathering data while they exhaust themselves trying to understand you. This is not about playing games. It's about not being played. Because once people know your buttons, they press them. Once they see your emotional patterns, they use them. But when you remove the map, when your behavior becomes intentional instead of reactive, they are lost, confused, powerless. The unpredictable man becomes the ghost in the war room. He haunts the battlefield not by fighting, but by not showing up the way they expect. And in that confusion, he takes ground without resistance, because people can't defend against what they don't understand. And nothing is harder to fight than a man who doesn't flinch, doesn't chase, and never plays his cards too soon. The unpredictable man doesn't just withhold reaction, he masters silence, not as a tactic, but as a principle. In a world addicted to noise, silence becomes a superpower. Machiavelli once wrote, "A man who reveals nothing controls everything," and that truth echoes louder today than ever. Because the man who can stay quiet in a world that demands constant explanation, constant apology, constant justification, that man owns the game. He doesn't waste energy trying to be understood. He doesn't argue to defend his choices. He doesn't flinch when he's misjudged. He simply moves with precision, with purpose, and without permission. Silence is not absence, it's intention. It's restraint sharpened into dominance. When you delay your response, when you refuse to be baited into a reactive state, you flip the script. Now they wait, they wonder, they fill in the blanks with anxiety, with overthinking, with doubt. And all the while, you remain still, not passive, composed. The man who commands silence commands the frame. He creates tension without raising his voice. He shifts dynamics without lifting a finger, because when others speak impulsively and reveal their motives, he listens, calculating, watching, storing everything. And when he does speak, every word lands with weight, not because it's louder, but because it's earned. This kind of silence isn't natural, it's built. It's trained in solitude, refined through discipline. It's forged by a man who no longer seeks to be heard just for the sake of noise. He doesn't explain to be liked. He doesn't justify to be accepted. And he doesn't apologize for being unreadable. His silence is a mirror, one that reflects everyone else's chaos. People reveal their insecurities in silence. They scramble to fill it, to escape it, to control it. But he stays rooted because he doesn't fear misunderstanding. He doesn't beg to be seen. He understands the truth. If you can hold your ground in silence, you can hold your ground anywhere. In power, clarity is often less important than mystery. Goals that are hidden are harder to sabotage. Intentions that are masked cannot be used against you. The free man knows this. That's why he speaks less and watches more. That's why he lets his actions define him, not explanations. That's why he doesn't react when provoked. Because to react is to lose shape. To explain is to give away positioning. To apologize when you've done nothing wrong is to surrender ground. But when you say nothing, you give them nothing to work with. That is the edge silence gives you. It doesn't just protect you, it elevates you. You rise above the noise not because you shout over it, but because you outlast it. And while the world chases attention and argues for influence, you move without sound. Purposeful, focused, undistracted. That's not just discipline, that's freedom. And in the hands of a man who cannot be controlled, silence becomes more than strategy. It becomes a throne. Control is the currency of modern slavery, and the man they cannot buy, distract, or seduce, he breaks the system. That's the ultimate threat. A man who cannot be owned, not by money, not by attention, not by desire. A man whose choices are not reactions, but responses. Strategic, deliberate, rooted in conviction. While others are pulled by temptation, emotion, or social pressure, he remains anchored. He's not here to prove a point. He is the point. His calm becomes confrontation. His silence becomes command. And his presence alone exposes what others are trying so hard to hide. This kind of man doesn't need to shout to be heard. He doesn't need to perform to be respected. Because he's not playing for the crowd. He's playing the long game. He's trained his mind to separate urgency from importance. He doesn't move unless it matters. He doesn't respond unless it's earned. And that restraint, that composure under pressure, reveals something deeper than confidence. It reveals sovereignty, total internal rule, and that cannot be purchased. The world, especially today, is built to buy your attention, to hook your emotions, to pull you into movements, arguments, trends, and addictions that feel urgent but are meaningless. They want you distracted. They want you impulsive, because the more you react, the easier you are to guide. But the man who has mastered himself has burned through those impulses. He has chosen clarity over chaos. And in doing so, he becomes immovable, not passive, intentional. He doesn't ignore the world. He simply refuses to be run by it. And here's the twist. The more he refuses, the more others reveal. His lack of need forces people to confront their own. His stillness reflects their noise. His independence reminds them of their dependence. And that makes them uncomfortable because he's not bending and they are. That discomfort becomes pressure. Pressure turns into self-exposure. People start explaining themselves when he hasn't asked a question. They defend positions he hasn't challenged. They try to impress a man who isn't watching. Why? Because they feel him. His presence shifts the emotional tone, not through domination, but through control of himself. Machiavelli understood this kind of influence. He knew that power wasn't just about what you can do, it's about what you refuse to do. Refuse to chase, refuse to beg, refuse to be baited. That refusal becomes a boundary. And boundaries draw attention, because in a world where everyone leaks energy, the man who contains his becomes rare. That rarity is expensive. You can't fake it. You can't imitate it. Because it's built layer by layer through discomfort, discipline, and detachment. The man who cannot be bought isn't just rich in money, he's rich in will. He stands alone, not because he has to, but because he can. And that kind of freedom isn't for sale, it's forged. And once it's yours, no one, not the crowd, not the critics, not the system, can take it from you. The man who cannot be controlled doesn't shout about it. He doesn't walk into a room demanding respect. He doesn't seek applause or explanation, because he knows true power is quiet. It doesn't beg to be seen. It doesn't chase permission. It simply is. The man who can't be held, can't be boxed, can't be broken, moves on his own rhythm. While the world rushes in cycles of reaction, panic, and persuasion, he moves like time itself, forward, steady, and unstoppable. He doesn't follow the rhythm of the crowd. He creates his own. And slowly, silently, the world begins to follow him. You see, this isn't rebellion. Rebellion still depends on what it reacts to. This is higher. This is sovereign presence. The man who can't be controlled doesn't resist the system just to prove a point. He's simply not part of it. He's above the need to fit in, to please, to comply. His life is not a performance. It's a decision. And that decision radiates. Others feel it in the way he speaks with precision, not noise. In the way he moves with intent, not urgency. In the way he listens without needing to respond and stands without needing to be invited. You won't find this kind of man everywhere, because he's rare. Not because he was born different, but because he chose different. He trained for this. He suffered for this. He sharpened his discipline in silence while others were busy performing for attention. And now, that silence speaks louder than any argument. That restraint commands more than any display. He doesn't fight for control, he embodies it. Not through domination, but through deep, unshakable self-mastery. And here's the truth. Becoming this man is not about becoming someone else. It's about returning to yourself. Stripping away the need to be liked. Peeling back the layers of performance. Letting go of the impulse to explain, defend, prove. It's about choosing calm over chaos, clarity over confusion, stillness over spectacle. You don't need to dominate the world to be powerful. You only need to stop letting it dominate you. So don't aim to be liked. Aim to be untouchable. Not because you resist control, but because you have no need to be controlled. No one owns you, not your past, not your fears, not the expectations of others. You move with a mind of your own, and that, in a world of followers, makes you a force. This is the final lesson. You don't have to roar to rule. You don't have to fight to win. You only have to refuse to be moved, unless it's on your terms. That refusal, held in silence and carried with discipline, is the beginning of quiet dominance, of freedom, of power. And once you become that man, the man who cannot be held, you won't need to prove a thing, because everyone will already feel it.